KTAL News Now, live with Brittany DeFran.
Hello everyone, happy Friday. Thanks for tuning in to the KTAL News Now Digital Streaming Center. My name is Brittany DeFran and you are joining us because we are covering live reporting on breaking news. We're at the scene developing stories in real time and covering the most important stories of the day. We're taking deep dives into issues you care about and you are joining us today. Our NBC6 News team has been following this trial since day one. Thanks to our digital executive producer, Carolyn Roy, who is with me today here. She has been able to give us an inside look of that courtroom and what's been going on. So we are taking an inside look of that courtroom. When we talk about that, we're talking about the Taylor Parker capital murder trial. So to get everyone caught up pretty quickly here, a Bowie County jury convicted Taylor Parker on October 3rd of capital murder and kidnapping in the death of 21-year-old Reagan Hancock and her unborn baby Braxlynn Sage. Now, the same jury is looking to see if they're hearing testimony in the penalty phase now, and in this trial, they will determine whether she will get the death penalty or life in prison. So if you are just joining us for the first time, you can get caught up on ktalnews.com. We have in-depth coverage since day one in regards to everything that has gone on. But today will be focusing on what has happened this week. And so this week we had a chance to hear testimony on behalf of the defense. So we're going to go ahead and unfold all the events that have taken place this week. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for taking a look at what has happened this week. Thanks for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you.
Awesome. So another week into this, we are going to just start from the top. What happened Monday. It seems the trial kind of recessed a little earlier this week, but let's kind of go off the top in regards to how the prosecution rested and kind of the defense took their place and presented their case. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So Wednesday, the trial recessed a little earlier in the week than it usually does. Usually it goes Monday through Thursday with Fridays off. They wrapped up Wednesday early in the afternoon because the defense ran out of witnesses that were available to take the stand. So, like you said, the prosecution rested its case after bringing just, I think, two more witnesses to the stand on Monday morning. Monday would have been the 10th day of the penalty phase of the trial, the beginning of the fourth week of this phase of the trial to determine the sentence for Taylor Parker. And the witnesses that it brought to the stand were Corrections Department, Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Director of Records and Data. I'd have to look at it again, but basically he's in charge of probably keeping track of the statistics too. But it's an administrative role with the TDCJ, who was able to talk about the life in prison, comparing the population and how they're housed as compared to people who are on death row. And so he talked about what life was like there in both scenarios. But he also talked about some of the statistics having to do with assaults in prison and some of the rules and regulations and just how inmates are given this pretty thick packet when they get there, detailing what how they can expect life will be behind bars. Not everyone in the general population of the prison at Gatesville, which is where Taylor Parker would be. Either way, she'll end up at Gatesville. The question is whether she'll end up in the facility called the Mountain View Unit, which is where the death row inmates, the female death row inmates in Texas are housed, or in another facility at Gatesville, which is a general population facility where there are people there who are serving life without parole, but there are others who are serving lesser sentences. So there are people that will be going back to the outside, so to speak. So we got a very deep dive into the differences between those types of facilities, the differences in security and in life in general for inmates, depending on what level of security they come in on. Interesting, because the gist of what the prosecution clearly was trying to show the jury was that even if Taylor ends up getting life in prison, she'll end up basically being housed in dormitories with 34 women to a dormitory, as opposed to where she is now, even in administrative segregation or here at Bi-State, where they're in a segregated pod with individual cells within that pod, but it's, I think there's only 4 pods or 4 cells in a pod here at Bi-State. It's supposed to be limited contact. That's the idea. But as we've heard through this trial, her contact has been much less limited than intended while she's been incarcerated there since her arrest in October 2020. So she's been able to get out of her cell for the longer than 1 hour a day that you're supposed to have on ADSEG. She's been able to get out and around and see other trustees, pass notes, all kinds of things. There's many more than hours than 1 hour, typically daily. And so what the prosecution was trying to show was that if you were to put her in that sort of G3 as sort of the mid-level inmate security status that she would be going in with if she were to get life in prison. So she should be mingling with other inmates who might be in there for lesser crimes and be able to have a lot of socialization and really build a life in there, go to classes, go to sort of self-improvement programs, work different kinds of jobs, although she wouldn't be able to work, I don't think. Well, in the life in prison scenario, she may actually be able to work different kinds of jobs that are much, much more limited than they would be on death row. So the idea there was she could still cause trouble, basically, compared to the kind of trouble that she's been, causing at the Bi-State jail, where she's been able to pass notes and try to frame other inmates, get away with having a lot of contraband in her cell, and all kinds of things, wearing makeup. Whereas on death row, they showed pictures of the literal death row that the women are housed in Gatesville, how it's a separate facility. They talked about how corrections officers that are assigned to that unit in particular are not inexperienced. They're not sort of as young and as short-staffed in that unit as they might be in other parts of the prison, or even in other parts of really the Texas correction system as a whole. There's just no doubt about the fact that a lot of these facilities are very short-handed, short-staffed. There's turnover. The pay isn't necessarily great starting out. So one of the things that they emphasized during this testimony on Monday was that the officers that go and guard and are in charge of ensuring the security of the death row inmates are handpicked and experienced, and they're not going to allow the kind of sort of manipulation and hijinks, basically, that have been described as Taylor has been doing at Bi-State. So it was really interesting testimony. It's kind of in depth. Like I said, it talked about statistics, about the number of assaults, and how female prisoners act differently. They can be just as violent, if not more. One of the pieces of testimony that kind of stood out to me was if a female inmate, not if a female inmate, but female inmates, if they are going to attack, will try to, they said, cut the victim in the face because they want to mark what they did, kind of thing. You get the impression that it can be vicious. So the concern being, if you're in there trading commissary items or other things of value, or making promises of things of value in exchange for doing things like Taylor's been doing here, that could really cause some problems, because there can be assaults, there can be retaliation, there can be basically violence. So that was the morning full morning of testimony, and then the state rested its case. So after 10 days of testimony, and then 3 weeks of testimony of the state's presenting its case, just about all the hijinks in jail, like I said, and the testimony we heard about from the medical examiner on the cause of the baby's death, and some of the just very cruel details that were further revealed about how Reagan died and how the baby was removed, and all of that wrapped up on Monday. It seemed kind of sudden, but they had laid out a very thorough case, so it was the defense's turn to get started.
Yeah, definitely laid out a thorough case. I mean, it's been, they kind of spent, I would say it was about 2 weeks, I think, that they spent presenting their...
3 on the sentencing phase. 3 weeks and, 10 days total. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and then so this week, so as Carolyn mentioned, the state rested on Monday, and then that's where the defense kind of picked up and, allowed it was their turn basically to, present the testimonies on their behalf. And so we've heard from a few people this week, but I think let's start off with Taylor Parker's mother. She's the first one that took the stand. Can we talk a little bit about what the jury learned from her testimony?
Sure, yeah. Shauna Pryor was the first to take the stand in the defense of her daughter. And it was 2 days of testimony. She took the stand Monday after the state rested, testified for the rest of the afternoon, and then came back Tuesday morning. So on Monday afternoon, the first part of her testimony really just dug into Taylor's childhood, how she was raised, what she was like as a teenager. And of course, it got a little bit into the medical issues and really the false medical claims that the prosecution says Taylor's perpetrated for years. So we heard everything from what Taylor was into as a middle schooler. She was in competitive cheerleading, how she in third grade in particular, she was doing fine in second grade, got to third grade and started complaining of stomach issues suddenly that would resolve on the weekends but come back on, school days. So Shauna Pryor testified about how they quickly kind of figured out that it clearly had something to do with school, and they decided that there was a third grade teacher, that just wasn't giving Taylor the feedback she needed, was Shauna Pryor's take on it, and that it resolved itself and fourth grade was fine. It wouldn't have been brought up if there weren't a reason that the defense thought that was somehow relevant. Not sure what that was in the grand scheme of things, but it was said on the stand. But they also asked the defense attorney, Jeff Harrelson, also asked Shauna about more about childhood and teenage behavior, where the divorce that Shauna and her husband went through when Shauna and her younger brother, Shauna would have been, I think, Taylor and her younger brother. Taylor, I think, would have been around 10 or 12 at the time of the divorce. Her brother was around 8. And we later heard from her brother, too, on the stand. But she testified to how the divorce, they tried to keep things civil, but that her ex, Mark Morton, really didn't take it very well. So they tried to do that nesting custody thing where the kids stay in the house, but the parents come and go. And she's described how, that didn't work for very long because her ex would refuse to leave because he wanted her back. He wanted to get the family back together. So that resulted in a big fight, and she figured that wasn't any better for the children than, having the kids come to them at their own homes, So, but also what came out of that was that, I guess, the children's father, they say, would kind of use the kids as a pawn to try to get their mother to come back. So supposedly when he had the children, he would drive around with them in the car to coworkers of Shauna's and have the kids knock on the door asking where their mother was. That was, again, nothing really comes up unless there's a point to it or maybe something that will be revealed later as being relevant. But that certainly seemed to be an effort to indicate that the kids had just not that it's unusual, unfortunately, these days for children to be in homes where the parents get divorced, but that the kids were used in a way as pawns. And so there was also an attempt to suggest that maybe Taylor was, at some point earlier in the trial and maybe in some of the pretrial documents, that maybe Taylor was taken to a drug house with her father, a house where people did drugs openly. And there might have even been a suggestion of some kind of sexual abuse. When her brother got to the stand, he said he remembered going to that drug house, but he never saw Taylor there. So I don't think that really went anywhere. So that was just the first half of her testimony. The next day really got into more of the medical stuff, although that first half, the defense actually got into it. Didn't touch on it that much, actually, now that I think about it. It was the prosecution that really pushed the next day when they got to do their cross-examination hard on when Taylor would claim that she kind of recounted the time when Taylor spent about 2 weeks in the ICU at the Tyler Medical Center in Tyler after going to the medical center in Mount Pleasant, complaining of waking up with like a migraine and seeing stars. She went to the ER that night, and supposedly before she went to the ER, she went to church that morning, and her grandmother said she noticed that her face was drooping. So she ended up going to the ER, and they could not figure out what was wrong with her. She was complaining of weakness and difficulty walking and even talking. So they ended up transferring her after not being able to find anything to the hospital, the bigger hospital in Tyler. That's where she spent the next 2 weeks. So that's all been talked about in the previous weeks of the trial, as the state has laid out its case that these claims were bogus. They brought the reports and the even some of the doctors, the medical records showing not only did they never confirm any of the illnesses and ailments that Parker was claiming, but that there were even notes in at least 3 of those documents that they brought up this week in cross-examination with Shauna Pryor, that there was no, not only no confirmation of a stroke or multiple sclerosis, whatever, but that there was actually evidence that she was elaborating or faking or exaggerating some of those symptoms, like that she was intentionally holding her tongue on the roof of her mouth so that she would talk funny, or that she would be inconsistent about the ability to use, her arm and things like that. I had to say at times that there were moments where it seemed like Shauna Pryor was bristled a little bit at some of the questions from the cross-examination. But one thing that was really noticeable about this was that the first assistant district attorney, Kelly Crisp, who can be very tough on a witness, she doesn't pull any punches, and she can be very straightforward, did not go as hard on Shauna Pryor as I've seen her go on some of the other lines of questioning. So it was interesting, and it seemed to be because I think the last thing they want to do is maybe make Shauna out to be the bad guy here, when it's Taylor that they want the focus to remain on for the jury's consideration. Who is really responsible for this, So I'm trying to think of any other highlights from that testimony. I'm sure there were. If anybody has any questions about it, I'm happy to ask or answer them, though.
Yeah, we can maybe move forward a little bit here, but that's definitely really a good analysis there. Yeah, okay, let you finish your thought.
The other thing that did come out of that, which I thought was interesting, was I think it almost seemed like too that it was something that Shauna Pryor wanted to make sure she said, which was that how angry and frustrated she was with how people were taking some of these pretrial documents that had been released. We've done stories on them about these extraneous offenses, notice of extraneous offenses that the state is required by law to file and make available to the defense for its review, ahead of the trial. It's public record, though. It has to be published to the court, the public record. So on the stand, she talked about this, and she talked about how people were speculating about her role and responsibility for Taylor's crime, and how she felt it was unfair. So, and you could sense that, and you could definitely feel that anger from her about that and that frustration about it. And I think so. That's another thing, is I think maybe Kelly Crisp didn't want to negate that, that real frustration, probably, that she hasn't been able to say anything until now. She's been, on the list to be a witness for all this time, and probably was itching to be able to say something about that, about how unfair it was. So.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people were waiting to hear from her as well. So, it's just interesting to hear how she kind of expressed and answered some of the questions that were asked. Even just your last analysis before, finishing your thought there, just, how the prosecution, handled that cross-examination. Yeah. And then, so let's move forward a little bit here in regards to some of the other family members that testified. I know you mentioned the brother. Was there anyone else? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I just remember something else, I swear. Just back to Shauna for a second. The other, I think, main takeaway from her testimony was that while she admitted that Taylor was dishonest, had a history of being dishonest, she did not believe that Taylor was faking those symptoms. She felt that she saw the symptoms for herself, she really questioned why would a doctor send them to a specialist repeatedly? Why would they not just say straight out, your daughter is faking, these symptoms? And so she, at one point she said, why would they do that? Why would they do that? I don't believe that it's these illnesses are fake, because why would they do that? So, just to kind of, the bigger picture of her testimony, there was a lot of resistance to the idea. So, and they also talked about her hysterectomy, how it was Shauna Pryor that had to make that decision back in 2015, when she had that emergency surgery, and how Shauna blamed her mother, or let her mother believe, definitely blamed her, but not to her face, but let her believe that she was the one that was responsible for Taylor not being able to have kids. And as Kelly Crisp pointed out to her on the stand, you didn't learn until, I think, the grand jury in November 2020, a month after Taylor Parker's arrest, that she'd actually had her tubes tied a full year, maybe a year and a half before that hysterectomy. So don't you think you were manipulated? Your daughter let you think that you were the one responsible, that she couldn't have kids anymore. So that was interesting too. All right, enough about that. I can talk about the brother. There was a lot. Yeah, the next witness on the stand was not the brother, but the sister of Taylor's daughter's father, if you can follow. So it would have been Taylor's daughter's aunt. Taylor's daughter's father is not in her life, according to multiple people who have taken the stand, including Shauna. So Jennifer Whiteside got up on the stand and just said that, talked about how when Taylor was 17 or so, she got pregnant with her brother, who was 19, came to live on the family compound in a trailer there on the property. But it didn't last long, because Taylor would be upset and crying, and Jennifer Whiteside testified that she basically told Taylor, look, Taylor believed that he was cheating, and Jennifer Whiteside said, he's going to be stepping out, he is talking to other women, it's not going to change. And Taylor packed her stuff and left. So it just was establishing why Taylor's daughter's real father, biological father that is not in her life, for whatever that's worth, and that he has never met her as far as she knows. And I think he was ordered to pay child support, and I don't think he's paid it. I think he had to have his wages garnished for that. So then the next witness on the stand was Taylor's younger brother, Zach Morton. And he came across as really genuine in both his outrage at the lies that his sister told, not just the pregnancy, but before that, and his sadness and regret at what happened with Reagan's family, which was really touching. I think it was an emotional moment as far as testimony goes. It was not that he got emotional, but you could feel the genuine nature of he's just sincere. He was very sincere. So what he talked about, again, was remembering going to a drug house with his father. What he knows now was drug. Back then he didn't know. And he would just watch TV with the older gentleman that lived there while his father and some other occupants of the house were off somewhere else, but that his sister was never there. But he did talk about how his father had a pattern of not really paying attention to his kids or being there for them unless he needed something from them. There were more than one parallel, drawn between maybe Taylor's father and Taylor as far as similarities. I can rattle off 3 right now off the top of my head. 1, they're both good cooks, apparently. They both love to cook. 2, according to Kathy Frost, who also took the stand on Tuesday, and is Taylor and Zach's grandmother, and Mark Morton, Taylor's father's ex-mother-in-law, apparently he's a fantastic liar too, according to her. So the lying, the cooking, and then the third one was the pattern that Zach Morton talked about when he was saying, there was the driving the kids door to door and having them knock on their Shauna Pryor's co-workers' doors to make it sound like that she was MIA from their little family when in fact, they were separated. But it was this pattern of using the kids as pawns, of not being interested in the kids, kind of back-burnering them is really how Zach Morton put it. And so he testified that when Taylor had her gastric bypass weight loss surgery. She seemed to change after that. Her friends changed, and the main thing was that her behavior would change when she was, as he put it, chasing a man. And so this was all on direct questioning from defense attorney Jeff Harrelson. And so when he said that, she changed when she was chasing a man, Jeff Harrelson asked him, in what way, or can you give me an example? And Zach said, well, obviously the most recent example would probably be, Wade Griffin. And that, when she started chasing him, she changed again. And so it was actually, he led into that question by first asking Zach about what kind of mother that Taylor Parker was. He said basically whenever he saw her with the kids, she was taking good care of the kids, that they seemed like they always had what they needed, that kind of thing. And when that would change would be when she was chasing a man. So when Wade came into the picture, not so good a mother anymore, according to Zach, because she was too busy focusing on what she wanted, which was getting that man. But when she got married, in her 2 previous marriages, he saw a pattern there where she was very focused on her family and taking good care of the kids. So I think that was just establishing a little bit of chasing, a little bit of neediness, and also neglecting family in pursuit of that one self-centered thing, which he recognized as a pattern as being similar to their father. So hopefully that made sense. There's other testimony from him too about how he tried to call Taylor out, and how back when Taylor and Wade started dating at first, and as we've reported, Taylor asked Wade to take a look at doing some clearing work on the Nolan property, the family's property, and putting up some pretty expensive pipe fencing, several $1,000s worth of fencing. So around this time, Zach Morton testifies that he got a Facebook message from Wade Griffin saying something about that Taylor had told him, or that he was going to be he's bringing over a welding trailer. This was the first that Zach had heard anything about him bringing over, as in Zach bringing over a welding trailer to Wade's property so he can do this work on the family land. Zach didn't know what that was about. So he questioned Taylor about it, and Taylor told him, according to his testimony, that she didn't know what she was going to do or how she was going to pay for it. And so he said, I don't have the money right now. You need to call Mom. So she did call Mom. What she didn't know was that it was a 3-way call and Mom was on mute. Taylor didn't know. Or that on that first call, Zach was on mute. So I think in both calls, Zach was on mute in one, Mom was on mute in the other. The point is, Taylor had conversations with her brother and her father in separate calls where she told very different stories, basically.
You said mother, father, you said brother, yeah. Father, or brother, mother?
Brother and mother.
Okay.
My bad. But the point is, when Taylor did not know that one or the other was listening in, she told different stories, which isn't surprising given the testimony that we've heard that she would do that. But he heard it, and it confirmed for him there was a lot of lying going on, right? So he was not happy. On the stand, he called it, I think it was Harrelson that asked him, well, what did you think of that? He said it was outrageous. I was outraged. So he confronted Taylor again, and this time he gave her a ultimatum to come clean with Wade about everything, because there was also, this is around the time that she's trying to buy Pecan Point property, $5 million land deal, knowing that she has no money, knowing that she has no inheritance or oil and gas money or anything of the sort. And he was just tired of being dragged into these things that he had nothing to do with. So he gave her an ultimatum that you need to come clean with Wade by 10 o'clock tonight. Tell him that you do not have this money that you say you do, all of it. And I guess, according to his testimony, his mother, it got heated. He ended up hanging up, and his mother later asked him to give Taylor until the next day. So the next morning he woke up to a pretty lengthy text from who was supposed to be Wade's number. But the way Zach described it was that in his experience, these were not things that a good old country boy would say. And just from the testimony that I've seen from Wade, and just knowing what he means by good old country boy, they're just not long-winded and they don't get into detail that much. But he said this text was full of lies and things that didn't make sense. So he tried to actually call the number back and he was blocked. He tried to get on Facebook and reach out to Wade that way, but he had been blocked. He got on his wife's Facebook and tried to reach out to Wade that way, and she had been blocked. So he was cut off now after confronting his sister and giving her this this ultimatum, this deadline to come clean. So they didn't have contact after that. In fact, I don't think he saw her again until maybe Christmas. They had a family gathering, and he said even at that point he did want to pull that text out because it was going, it was saying, how dare you do this to Taylor and not help her and all this kind of stuff. When he, I think Zach clearly suspected it was not Taylor writing that diatribe, but he wanted to show both of them, when they were both in the room together. But it was obviously maybe family Christmas wasn't the place to do that. So, and the other big takeaway from Taylor's brother's testimony was that, again, he really didn't want anything to do with this case, this trial. It has been tough on the Parker family, who did not and are not responsible for the crime itself. The prosecution has made a point to say, but still, it's been a difficult time for them, and it's a horrific thing to have your name linked to. She goes by Parker, but she was a Morton maiden name, so his name is Zach Morton. So he didn't want any more to do with it than they had to, but he came around to understanding or believing that he needed to be helpful and let the system do what the system does in the justice system, and he would go along with whatever the jury decided. So that was explained. He explained that on the stand, and also that Kelly Chris said, I understand you've reached out and offered your condolences to Reagan Hancock's family, and he certainly has. And the way he said, I will always, I think was the emotional part. Like, he genuinely, sincerely does regret what happened to that family and to Reagan and the baby. So it was touching.
Well, it's definitely very emotional and tragic loss for that family. So it's interesting to hear how he kind of addressed that specifically. I want to move on a little bit from that and talk a little bit about this. We have a question here in our comment section, and it's addressing some sort of confrontation that was outside of the courtroom. Can we talk a little bit about that and just what happened there?
Yeah. That happened after Shauna Pryor wrapped up her testimony on Tuesday afternoon. Normally, witnesses, family members who may take the stand are kept out of the main traffic areas. There's a separate room that they can sit in while they're waiting to be called, or if they're not necessarily going to be called that day, but they want to be in the courthouse, they have a separate room. So they try to keep witnesses and family members of the defendants separate for the most part. But on this day, I think Shauna was done testifying, and so she was walking out of the bathroom. At the end of the day, the court had recessed for the day, and Reagan's aunt, Jamie, happened to be walking by, and I think there was eye contact. I was actually walking behind them at the time, but I think my eyes were blurry by then, by that point of the day. And it took me a second to realize who I was standing behind or walking behind and what was happening. I just heard Jamie's voice telling her, you better not talk to me that way. You did that, your daughter did this, so you have no right to talk, So it turned out that what apparently had happened was that when they made eye contact, Shauna, who can be, frankly a little gruff, a little caustic, just in general, she's this is difficult. This is her daughter, and this has been very hard on her family. She's not happy that her family's name has been talked about so much. So she's just not happy right now, and she just got finished testifying. So when she saw Jamie, she had an attitude, and she said, what are you looking at, or something like that. It wasn't quite that, but it was, do you have a problem, or something like that. It was just probably didn't need to be said, whatever it was. And of course, Jamie was upset. So voices were raised. It was heated a little bit, but they never got close to each other. I think Jamie kept walking away toward the rest of her family, which is a good thing. And later on, after Reagan's family left, I did see Shauna and other members of her family, including Zach, walking, being not escorted, but, you know, the jailhouse, the bailiff actually walked them to their car, just probably to make sure there weren't any more confrontations out in the parking lot. So.
Okay, so that kind of clears that up there for our viewer who asked that question, and, you know, what happened there. You know, as we kind of ended there in regards to the testimony that we heard on behalf of the defense, I know you mentioned that the cross-examination was pretty tough. Was there anything that you wanted to touch on that stood out to you in regards to that cross-examination?
Well, which witness? I would say the toughest cross-examination that we saw this week was when the former corrections officer that befriended Taylor Parker took the stand. That was Wednesday. That was actually the last witness to take the stand for the week. That's Deborah Kramer. She was at the bi-state for about 5 months, from June 2021 to November of that year, when she actually left to move to Louisiana and get married. But during that 5 months there, she testified that she got pretty close to Parker. She would pray with her a lot, and it sounded like spend quite a bit of time. And according to the notes they passed to each other, they spent time laughing together. And she was talking about how she's been in the ministry for 30 years, was raised in a Pentecostal family, very faithful, and how she didn't judge any of the inmates that she was, you know, in charge of guarding. And so that was another thing she said on the stand was, you know, I always tell all my inmates that I will not judge you. I'll treat you on the same level as anybody else on the outside until you give me a reason not to. That's what she said. So we've had testimony previously in the trial from other corrections officers who've had issues with Taylor, and others that are just jail supervisors who are talking about how there is training where corrections officers learn about the red flags, that inmates are very good at manipulation and will manipulate given the opportunity in a lot of cases. So having heard all of that along with the jury, it was clear that the relationship that this corrections officer had with Taylor Parker seemed suspect at the very least. It seemed maybe a little dangerous. The prosecutors have said as much. And some of the testimony with the state corrections officials, they talk about that too, how that is a concerning scenario to have a corrections officer who is so fond of an inmate that they would write a letter just gushing about how much she missed her and wanted to see her and come and pray with her, and even come to the trial with her, how she thinks about her all the time. Now, she's married. This was not a romantic relationship. It was just, obviously they bonded in some way. How she, in the letter that she wrote to Taylor Parker that was shown in court, she said that she would stop these crime shows all the time and talk to her husband about all the crazy things she saw in jail. And apparently that reminded her of Taylor. She also sent money. She sent $50 to put on Taylor's account to pay in case Taylor wanted to call her, which Taylor said she never got the money, so I don't think she ever did get a call from Taylor. But still, it was a lot of incredulousness on the part of the prosecution in the questioning. That was Assistant District Attorney Lauren Richards, and she was tough. She was really tough on Kramer, and it's up to the jury to decide whether that was deservedly so, but it was certainly dramatic because the point at which, you know, that Kramer was talking about how she believed, because she felt that she saw with her own eyes, that other corrections officers at the bi-state jail were actually mistreating Taylor Parker out of a vendetta on behalf of Homer Hancock, Reagan's husband, who used to work at the jail as a corrections officer. She thought, Kramer did, that they were not only not being too nice to her, but were actually mistreating her because of that. She recounted a story about how one day she was called to escort Taylor down to probably the medical unit, maybe somewhere else in the jail besides the segregated pod, to have hair samples taken for DNA comparison, because as part of the investigation, of course, all the hair that was found at the scene and embedded in Reagan's nails and on the couch and in the blood. They needed to know whose hair was whose. So she was called down there. There were 2 plainclothes men. She initially indicated on the stand. First, she actually misspoke and said they were from the defense team, but then she said, oh, the prosecution team. And then there was a little bit of a bench conference there between the state and the defense, and they came back and clarified that later, when on cross-examination, that initially when she had spoken with actually the state, the prosecution, because that letter got attention, right? We need to talk to this corrections officer who sent this letter. So when the prosecutor spoke with the first time with Kramer on the phone, Kramer said, oh yeah, I got to tell you about the time that they took a hair sample and they were mean to Taylor because they yanked her hair too hard. They grabbed too much to even get a sample, because you got to pull it out by a root to get a DNA sample. But the way she described it was this man, one of these 2, what turned out to be New Boston police officers, actually, which is what she told the prosecutors. But on the stand, she acted like they were from like the DA's office kind of thing. But anyway, that was one example she offered as Taylor being mistreated. And so also just, I think that she talked about how she never passed notes for Parker, but that she was given notes by Parker about how much she enjoyed sitting and laughing with her. And another one she got shortly before she left, I guess, the job to move to Louisiana was, that I'm already crying, missing you, Taylor wrote to her. And then she talked about how she, feels for the souls of and the broken people that tend to end up in jail because they've sinned, and how sad that was. The prosecution brought up social media posts where Kramer is talking about the trial itself and how sad it was that Taylor would never be able to plan her daughter's 16th birthday party, or go to her loved one's funerals, or have a life, basically, enjoy the holidays with the family, and how she was crying about it. And that's when Lauren Richards went in. She, I should back up. On the hair thing, the story about the hair sample, Lauren started with that and said, pulled up a picture from the crime scene of the bloody couch where chunks of hair were stuck in the blood, and asked her, do you know what this is? Of course, you could guess by the context, I'm sure, but she didn't know exactly. So she said that is hair that was found at the crime scene. Investigators needed it to do the match, to see whose hair it was. It was Reagan's. That's Reagan's hair. So you want to tell me that it hurts to have your hair pulled, is basically what Richard said. And then she pulled up a picture from the autopsy of Reagan's bloody hand with the chunk of hair in it. And she said the same thing. Do you know what this is? No, I don't. This is Reagan's hand. There's hair on it. We needed to know, the crime lab needed to analyze and cross-check hair samples between what was found in Reagan's fingernails and fingers with Parker's sample, to see if that was Parker's hair that was that Reagan grabbed out of her attacker's head. And Kramer said that was sad or something like that. It was just hardcore way to go about it, but it was effective in the sense that here was this corrections officer who had what prosecutors would say was a borderline, if not completely inappropriate, relationship with an inmate, and the brutality of Taylor's crime, that hair pulling could be any comparison to what was done to Reagan, basically. And so later, when we were listening to the testimony about the social post and looking at these posts where Kramer was heartbroken about Taylor's future in life, she's never going to be free again. Lauren said, do you realize what Taylor Parker was doing on her daughter's birthday? And Kramer said she did not. And so Richard said she spent the entire day stalking for a victim in East Texas. I think she was referring to the days leading up to the murder, where she was probably stalking a clinic in Paris, Texas, September 19th, I think she said. So that was around that time. And to that, Kramer said, that's also sad. And Richard said, it's disgusting. And that was the most sort of emotional punch verbally that I've heard coming from Lauren Richards. But I think that was a intentional approach in that case to just go pretty hard on that corrections officer.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been really like eye-catching almost to like just be sitting there watching that encounter between the two of them in that moment.
There was a lot of, she had a frown on her face at some points. It made me wonder, is she rethinking? But in the end, I don't think so. She was steadfast in that she does not judge. She's not God, so she's not going to judge what anybody does. Some would question whether that really necessarily applies. Even Richard said, you're a very faithful and forgiving person. I give you credit for that. I'm a forgiving person too, but don't you think that God, meeting God in heaven does require taking responsibility for your sins, So there's a bit of questioning Kramer's consistency in terms of saying that it was her faith that led her to treat Parker seemingly different. I mean, she said she never gave her special treatment, but she also said she never felt there was a reason to shake down her cell, and all this contraband was found in her cell after Kramer's departure. Not that it was searched because of Kramer's departure, but when other corrections officers were responsible for checking the rooms, checking the cells, stuff was found. So it seemed to suggest that she might have been able to get some stuff in there, maybe that she wouldn't have otherwise been able to keep.
All right, we're going to go ahead and move on a little bit more here. We're going to just kind of talk a little bit about what's next. What can people expect? Is there any idea of maybe when we should expect a wrap-up of the trial?
Yeah, so we had, after they brought a psychologist to the stand, not a psychologist, an expert in future dangerousness to the stand on Wednesday. And when he finished testifying, the defense did not have any other witnesses available to take the stand. That's why things did wrap up a bit earlier than they do, than it does usually. So next week, that defense expert witness, which is a neurologist from New York, is supposed to be in town and should take the stand. There are a couple of other witnesses that could be called to the stand. We did learn this week that even though Taylor's daughter, who's now 12, was on the witness list, she will not be taking the stand. Instead, they played some jail calls between Taylor and her daughter to kind of try to establish what the points they would have made if the little girl had taken the stand. But as you can imagine, Shauna Pryor, who has custody of Taylor's little girl, agreed with her husband that they just, it's not in her best interest to put the girl through that. So anyway, I'm not sure who else necessarily will end up getting called to the stand, but I know that neurologist is probably, or is definitely on the list for Monday. It's possible that the state or the defense could wrap up its case maybe Monday afternoon or maybe Tuesday morning, at which point each side will get a chance to kind of rebut each other's cases. How long that takes really just depends on how much each side feels that they need to address before the jury is given the charge, so to speak. That's the term they use for telling the jury what they have to consider and the options they have to answer. And that's those three special answers that are required by Texas law. It's kind of unique in Texas the way that works. We've talked about it before. I'm sure we'll talk about it again. So it could go to the jury where they have to consider those three questions as early as Wednesday. That might be best case scenario, but as early as Wednesday possibly. That's what they were saying at the end of the day on Wednesday before court recessed until Monday.
All right.
I don't know if we can, but I can tell you this, and there's stories online, of course, the details of it. But all the testimony from that future dangerousness expert was actually very interesting too, not just because of what he found over 5 hours of interviewing Parker in 2 sessions and reviewing her records, her statements to police that were recorded on video, and those confession letters, those faked confession letters. His takeaway from the whole thing was she is a pathological liar, which is not, in the DSM-5, the manual that's basically used to diagnose mental illness, but in and of itself, pathological liar is not like, it's not listed in there like manic depressive is, that kind of thing. But she had elements of some of the cluster B type personality disorders that are in the manual, and that included narcissism, histrionic, and antisocial behavior. But because she didn't have enough of the features of each of those or any of those to be diagnosed with any one of them straight up, she wasn't diagnosed with any. So basically he's saying, yes, she is a pathological liar with features of narcissism, histrionics, and antisocial behavior, but she is not mentally ill. That she will continue to not tell the truth. She will continue to sow chaos. But ultimately, he said, in his opinion, he can't. It's not that he can't, but it's difficult. He said it's difficult to predict whether she would, in particular, Taylor Parker, that was who was brought in to review, would be at high risk for committing violence again. And so you might wonder, why does that matter if Taylor's going to be behind bars no matter what she gets for the rest of her life? Well, you have to consider the safety of other inmates and corrections officers and staff that she'll be housed with. So they do have to, she may not be ever going to step outside into the world again like they hope other prisoners could be rehabilitated to do, but it's still part of the death penalty question. It's just, is this person likely to commit future violence? So that was a big part. It will be, I'm sure, a major factor in what the jurors have to consider when they do go to deliberate. And so him saying, I can't be sure because she doesn't have a history of violence. He called the murder an isolated incident, meaning it just happened once. It's not that she hasn't had any violent incidents in the bi-state jail. So, and he said that people with histrionic don't necessarily have a history of, or even pathological liars have a history of acting out violently. So that was interesting. It's a bit of a controversial topic right now, actually, in Texas, particularly. It's a big death row or big capital punishment debate over whether it's even possible to really predict accurately whether an offender will offend again. So even that witness that was on the stand, that's one of the things that Kelly Crisp kind of went at with him, was quoting his words in an article about a recent case. I think it was just last year that he actually recanted his testimony in a case that sent a man to death row. Not because he changed his mind or thought his assessment was wrong, though. I think he said on the stand that was about statistics being inaccurate. Because they're trying to be scientific about something that is a probability or possibility of someone, who has committed a violent crime, whether they would do it again. How do you do that scientifically? So there's question as to whether it really can be. So one of the quotes that she used was him saying it's not that useful, basically. And that is a paraphrase. It's in the story online if you want to read it. But, he was a little defensive about that. But it is a hot topic.
That was actually, you kind of like jumped into my brain right there. No, I mean, it was like very interesting because that was like my next question, or, it was just, I was thinking the same thing. So it's interesting that, that is a hot topic, and I can see why. I understand why. And I'm sure, we probably will hear a little bit more about that as we kind of get closer to the end of this trial and the end of the sentencing phase here. One thing I want to ask you before we kind of close out here. Since we heard about the civil suit that Homer Hancock filed, has there been anything, any updates in regards to that, or has that been brought up at all through this phase of the trial?
Well, I wouldn't be able to bring that up in this phase. I'm not sure that it would be relevant in any way to do so anyway. So the lawsuit was filed, I think, October 10th. It's now November 4th. And last week, the attorney representing Wade Griffin filed a response to that lawsuit. Basically saying, actually I have it here, so I was trying to read it. A lot of it's like typical boilerplate stuff in that, my client is not responsible for this. It's Taylor Parker, who was the person who committed the crime, is responsible. So criminal acts by a third party, and a lot of legalese, but basically that they're asking for a trial if this moves forward. So usually, you can ask for someone had just, you're involving insurance companies because it was filed as I think an auto, it's not on here, is it? Basically, they're going after the insurer of Wade's vehicle, insurance company that covers Wade's vehicle, for the liability and damage that they claim was Wade's responsibility because he let Parker borrow the car or drive the car when he should have known that she was acting erratically and all this kind of stuff. So it's it's not a very long response, and so the next thing we'll be looking for is a date to be set for a first hearing, and I don't believe there has been one set. I'll double check on that though. I'll update that in the comments if that's not the case. Actually, I can put the copy of the lawsuit. I have the lawsuit in the original story on our website, but I might add the response to it as well.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that update. So, and then I know you just said this, but so that information, that documentation is on our website, right? That's where our viewers can catch that. Okay, so you guys can see that all there. I'm going to answer a question we have here in our comment section asking about the guard. Sorry, can you remind me of her name again, Carolyn?
Not Deborah. Ooh, Deidre.
Deidre Hudson Kramer. So someone's asking a question about how she lost her job and why did she lose it. So she didn't lose her job. Yeah, she
made a point to say that she put in her notice. But she moved actually to Benton, she said. So she moved out of town, out of Bowie County, and she said she put in her notice. I have not heard anyone claim that's not the case. But it might not be something that the defense feels it needs to, or the prosecution needs to dig into any further than letting her say that on the stand. She put in her notice, and that may well be true. And she said she even planned on getting back into corrections. That was her first corrections job, she said, and she planned on getting back into it once she got settled in here in Bossier Parish on the Louisiana side of the line. But that the schedule didn't work out. She wanted to have the same schedule as her husband. So I guess in corrections, you don't necessarily get that sweet 9-to-5 job, maybe that didn't line up. So.
All right, and so we're going to go ahead and show you guys here that you can catch all of this and in-depth coverage on ktalnews.com. You can see it right here on our website. You can head on over to our main website page, ktalnews.com, and there will be a Taylor Parker quick links. You can click on that. That's going to take you to this page right here where you can see day-to-day coverage in depth of everything that we've been covering, everything that we've talked about since day one. But I think we're going to end off here. Carolyn, I just want to touch to you one more time. Is there anything else that you would like to say? Any last words?
I don't think so. I think I finally exhausted myself today. Hopefully it was helpful or informative at least.
Definitely. We definitely learned some new things today. Heard a new testimony this week. We'll be continuing to follow this next week. We'll have our same time, catch us here at the same time next week, Friday at 4 o'clock. But for now, thank you guys again. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comment section. We'll be sure to address them afterwards if we did not get to them during our live. But we'll see you guys next time. Hope you guys have a safe and good weekend.